in this episode of the Critical Oxygen podcast. Start with placement, establish a really good warm-up.
Yep.
Then you can start to get into like your intervals and assessments and other things like that. Welcome to the Critical Oxygen podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your endurance potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson. I have a PhD in molecular exercise physiology, and I'm the founder of Critical Oxygen, where my mission is to build better endurance athletes through remote education and in-person physiological testing. Today, I'm joined by Coach Dave Schell for another episode of Fast Physiology. In this episode, we're going to talk about how to use Near Infrared Spectroscopy, or NIRS devices, as a beginner, and some of the challenges you might face. Dave Schell, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So just a little bit of backstory. Dave and I have been furiously texting offline about his use of NIRS, and more specifically Moxy Monitor, for, I don't know, it's probably been like a few months at this point, or maybe a month, something along those lines. Where
I think it tailored off. It was pretty active last winter, and now as I get into indoor training again, it's become top of mind again. Yeah.
It's always fun to add more technology when you can actually get into, like a pseudo lab, right? Like, riding indoors, you're controlling everything a little bit better. Let's just add some technology, see if it's beneficial to us, see if it can help change our training, guide our training a little bit better, and getting kind of back on the proverbial bike, as it were. You're getting back into the swing of things with using Moxy Monitor. And just to clarify things, so Moxy Monitor is a piece of technology or a device that uses near infrared spectroscopy technology to determine the amount of oxygen that is in your muscle at any given time, whether you're resting or whether you're exercising. So the way that I kind of think about it is NIRS is the overarching technology, and what it does, like I said, shines red light into your muscle, and from there we can determine how much oxygen is in your muscle at any given time. And then Moxy is just one of the many companies out there that utilizes NIRS technology in order to be able to determine skeletal muscle oxygenation, or SMO2, which is a percentage from 0 to 100%. And the way that I kind of think about this, because I've been a staff physiologist for Moxy for I think like 6 years now. I started using it during my master's degree, is I think of it as a bioenergetic power meter. So if you're monitoring your SMO2, it's telling us a lot about how you're using oxygen and how you're making energy, in a sense. And changes in SMO2 will tell us how your body is coping with whatever exercise intensity that you're working at. So the big thing here is that we have to be able to interpret the signals and the numbers that are coming onto our Garmin watch, onto our phones, those sort of things, in order to actually get an accurate and reliable picture of what's actually happening in the muscle. So, Dave, I think this is kind of an overview for everybody, and just a reminder for you as well. So I'll give kind of, because this is a fast physiology episode, I'll give kind of like the 3 to 5 minute spiel of like, well, if you're interested in using one of these pieces of NIRS technology, and you get the device, this is how we do it for, say, Moxy Monitor. Is you get your Moxy Monitor, and the first thing you need to do is you need to figure out the best place to put your Moxy Monitor. If you place the Moxy on, say, like your kneecap, or something with a lot of tendons, then the signal that you're going to get is not going to be the same as if you properly placed it on a working muscle. What we're trying to do is we are trying to monitor shifts in muscle oxygenation, again, to tell us how our muscle is coping with the exercise that's actually going on. So the first thing you need to do is you need to find proper placement. And in order to do that, you need to place the Moxy on an active muscle. So if you're cycling, that's typically your quad, which is the front part of the top of your leg. And the quad is made up of 4 muscles. You have, I actually don't know all 4 of them, but you have your VMO, which is the very, very inside. You have your rectus femoris, which is kind of like the middle. And then you have your vastus lateralis, which is on the lateral or the outside. Typically speaking, I recommend people placing the Moxy on the vastus lateralis. It is generally the largest muscle, easiest to identify, easiest to get a, say, large dynamic range. So if you're a cyclist, start with the vastus lateralis. If you're a runner, the rectus femoris, which is the middle of the muscle, is used quite regularly, especially for road running. People from the Nike Sports Performance Lab really, really recommend they use the rectus femoris very, very often. I've had success placing a Moxy on my gastroc. So when you flex your calf, it's that big muscle, or there's 2 big muscles, but I do the inside portion of my calf. And I found that actually, I can place that, using a calf sleeve, and it just, stays right where I want it. And it's very responsive to both running and cycling. So if you're a runner, pick either the rectus femoris, which is the middle part of the muscle, or the calf. And then what you want to do after you pick an active muscle, so this can extend to whatever exercise you're doing, just find an active muscle. You want to place the Moxy on the muscle belly. So I'm sure that most of you have seen that when people flex, say, their arm, you see maybe a bulge in your bicep. The biggest portion of your bicep is the muscle belly. That's where you want to place the Moxy Monitor. And this is similar sort of phenomena with your leg. You place your heel into the ground, and then you straighten your leg as best you can. Typically that results in people flexing their quad. And then from there, you can actually look and see, how do the muscles change? Are there areas where it looks like the muscle is bulging a little bit more? If there is, then that is a great place to start for placing the Moxy Monitor. So you want to find, again, the active muscle. You want to go through that routine of, placing your heel straight into the ground, straightening your leg, finding an area where that muscle is the largest, and then placing the Moxy there. Then what you want to do is you want to do some sort of test to make sure that SMO2 changes when you add load. It goes down when you add load, because when we start to exercise, we start to use oxygen. So the first thing I do, if I think I have a good placement area, is I just have the individual or myself hold the Moxy in place, and then I actually just kind of do quarter squats. And I just do them kind of fast. I just go 1, 2, 1, 2, up, down, up, down, up, down. And what you'll see, if you have a good placement, is that SMO2 is going to start, anywhere between 30 to 70%, depending on the person. And then it should go down as you do your series of quarter squats that are kind of quick. You're kind of just doing enough to have contraction. If you don't have any change, then you need to move ever so slightly, maybe 1 to 4 or 5 centimeters up or down the Moxy, and then you want to repeat that process. You want to keep repeating that process until you get the most change, the most fluctuation in SMO2 that stays stable. And what I mean by that is that your SMO2 isn't going from 30% to 60% to 40% to 70%. That's not a stable signal. What you want is your SMO2 to go from 60 to 55 to 50 to 45 to 40. So you want something that is changing in a predictable manner. When you add load, SMO2 goes down. When you stand normally or release that load, SMO2 comes back up. Then what you do is you get on the bike, you get on your treadmill, whatever exercise activity you do the most, and then you just exercise, or you tape down the Moxy first and foremost, or stick it under some compression shorts that are tight enough to hold the Moxy in place. And then you do light load. Light load with the exercise, SMO2 should go down, and then it should stabilize. And if you do keep going, it might come back up. It might actually start to trickle back up just a little bit. But what you're looking for is that during the actual exercise you're doing, you are now getting to the point where SMO2 actually changes based on the exercise you're doing, not just during a squat. So that's the placement aspect of things. And once you find a good placement, then you can start to kind of get into the weeds with stuff. You can start to say, oh, well, how can I use Moxy for more optimal warmups? How can I use Moxy for maybe training readiness? Maybe, like doing interval training, doing other things like that. And I think that's where you and I are at now. Is Dave? We actually have been slowly, incrementally going through and trying to find a good placement for Dave, because sometimes when he places it on, say like he started with the vastus lateralis, then he moved to the rectus femoris, and we weren't getting the responses we were expecting. So we finally gone to the VMO, which is the very inner portion of your quad. And now I think we're finally getting some responses that actually are in line and make sense to what we would expect from a physiological perspective without actually going into that in super, super great detail right at this very moment. So Dave, why don't you share kind of what you've been going through and then the questions that you have, and we can talk from there.
Yeah, I think the big thing, like you said, first it's just trying to find a muscle that gives you a good reading. And so I've tried the rectus femoris. So that's kind of like right down the middle of your thigh, right in the middle of maybe the top third is where I'd put it there.
Yep. And
I would see it desaturate or the numbers start to go down during some efforts, but during a really hard effort, it might plateau sooner than I would think. And so there wasn't a lot of variability between different efforts, or at least I didn't think so, but maybe that based on what I sent you today and what you saw, maybe that's a little bit different, right? Like maybe I wasn't seeing it granularly enough to see the fidelity of it, right?
Yeah.
And then trying it on the outside portion of my leg. And then today I tried it on the inside portion, because that's typically when I'm trying hard efforts, that's where I seem to feel it. Like that seems to be the muscle that's getting the most tired, the most sore. And so I was thinking maybe that's, a key part of my limiting muscles or what have you. So yeah, at this point, it's like I'm just trying to find how I can use the Moxy or SMO2 data to inform my training. And like you said, like I definitely see, and I've used it with athletes, and they see the value in like the warm up now. And now they're all like super convinced, like a 10-minute warm up doesn't do it. Like they know like how it feels, and because they saw in real time the SMO2 come up. Right. And so like my warm up, depending on what type of workout I'm doing, like if I'm doing an endurance workout, then it's like, I just ride easy until the power comes up naturally. But if I'm doing like intervals, then I have a more structured workout or warm up where it's like 12 minutes easy, 4 minutes at like a tempo pace, another 4 minutes easy, and then 3 times 1 building. And you see it with the SMO2 where after each of those 1 minute efforts, it like goes up a little bit higher, goes up a little bit higher. So I see it there. Now the spot I'm trying to like figure out is like, how do I use it to inform my training? So like one, if I'm trying to do threshold intervals, am I at the right intensity, or is it too high? Because we've talked about how threshold will vary from day to day. And so it's like, I'm looking for, okay, my RPE tells me this feels like threshold today. Do heart rate and or SMO2 corroborate that, right? That's what I want. The other thing is like optimal intervals. And I think you and I have talked about this, where it's like, especially now with like Zwift and stuff like that, it's like people go in to like, they have 6 intervals planned, and I'm going to do those 6 intervals if it kills me. Right. But it's like, really, it should be flexible. And I want to have like, I'm going to do 3 to 6 intervals today. And the SMO2 is going to kind of help me determine either one, do I keep going or do I lower the target? Or do I just call it that day and save it for the next day? And so that's kind of where I'm at now. And that's why I'm like getting frustrated trying to find out like, how do I get reliable, repeatable results from day to day?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think where a lot of like the frustration from both of our perspectives was coming from was really the placement, because Dave is a unique individual where typically, like I said, I try to systematize almost everything, and systematically with cyclists, I start with the VL and I say, okay, we're going to start with the vastus lateralis, and he was getting responsive movement of SMO2 when he would do lower loads. But then what would happen is once he got above second threshold, SMO2 would essentially plateau. And I don't have like a perfect scientific explanation for this, but most likely what is happening is that you are maximizing the amount of muscular contribution from the vastus lateralis, and that is then just leading to a bottoming out in SMO2. The vastus lateralis can still continue to work, but then after it bottoms out, we have to actually transfer or recruit more muscles in order to get the force output that's necessary. So then the second thing, I was like, oh, well, for me personally, putting the Moxy on the rectus femoris is really good at finding a muscle that isn't or that is limiting my performance. So with SMO2 for me in the rectus femoris, the harder I work, if I ever get to a bottom point in my rectus femoris, so it's like 10% sometimes during like a VO2 max workout, then that's where fatigue happens. Like that's where like I'm toast. But with Dave, we measured it on him, and yet again, he had another plateau. And it was interesting because it's all kind of around the same percentage, but we're not going to get into that because I don't think it'll just be more confusing.
Right.
So with Dave, we were like, that's weird. Okay, so what are the other muscles in the quad? So now we've finally gone to the VMO, which is exactly like what you said. Oh, that's actually the one that feels like it's burning, it's getting tired, like those sort of things during my high intensity stuff. So I was like, okay, we'll put it there, and then we'll see what happens. And what we were looking for is we were looking for a place where below second threshold, SMO2 would plateau, and then above second threshold, SMO2 would just continually drop until it got to a low point. And I think because it's only been one day that we finally found that area. And something that Dave, was kind of getting hung up on, which is okay because it happens, is that so he did a warm up, right? It was it was a long warm up, I would say, actually, like 30, 40 minutes.
Yeah, it was just riding.
Yeah,
I just
riding.
rode for like 30 minutes, and then I did like a bit of a tempo effort. And again, we've talked about how cycling and running is a little bit different, but so it's kind of like a high zone 2 type effort. It's not like easy. It's like pushing into the moderate range. So I did that, and then I did 3 times 1 kind of hardish building. Yeah. And then a 3-minute effort, like all out, just to kind of test it again. And I think this is where you're going with it. Is like, I expect it to bottom out. I expect to get down to like 10 or 15%. Yeah. And it just doesn't seem like I can do that
right at this moment. And that's something that I think if you listen to, like, this is where like norms and stuff like that is like, we don't have enough data to give people norms for, like, what to expect when you're going all out for SMO2. And what I'll push back to people and say is, it doesn't matter what the norms say. It just matters what your physiology is saying. So with Dave, he was frustrated because during his tempo workout, his SMO2 went from like 60 to 65 to 52 or 53, something like that. So that's a difference of 13%. So it went down to 53. Then he did a series of 1-minute kind of like warm up primers, and his resting SMO2 is actually rising to a point where he got up to about 80% before he did his all out test. So he started at 80% and then he did an all out, and you can see his SMO2 is dropping negative the entire time. And it got down to what, 57%? So, something like that. So that's a 23% dynamic range, I would say.
Yeah,
so what I told Dave,
and 65 to 52 previously. Yeah.
Yep. So, and Dave was really frustrated. He's like, "Oh, this is ridiculous. Like every time I do this sort of stuff, it doesn't go down to the same place." And that's where I told him, I was like, "No, this is actually good, because the pattern that we're seeing is what we would expect. We see a plateau at tempo pace, which should be below second threshold. And then we see a negative slope, so negative SMO2 during that all-out interval. And the reason why I think it didn't go down to the same point is because your starting SMO2 is actually higher.
Yeah. And so I think like this is kind of what was going through my mind as I'm doing this. So there's kind of two things going through my mind. And we kind of talked about W prime, or other people call it FRC. And so this idea that like you have energy, a finite amount of energy you can do above threshold. Mm-hmm. And kind of when it gets to zero, it like the well's empty or whatever. So so that's one thing that I'm like expecting it to almost behave like that. But the other thing I'm like thinking about is like O2 kinetics and how does that look? So I'm like, oh, okay, maybe like it's going to take some time for the oxygen to catch up, and like, as you know what I mean? Like, so I what kind of drops should you expect to see in like a 30-second effort or 60-second effort versus a 3-minute effort or a 5-minute effort?
Yeah.
All out, I would say, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And this is again, like we are cracking open a massive can of worms that can't be answered in a 30-minute podcast. And that's why I've created, on like the Moxy Monitor, Academy website and other things like that, which I'll link in the description, like, videos where I walk through in more detail, like, limiter assessment, for example, like the 3-1 assessment and like other things like that. So the answer is it depends on the individual and their musculature and how well developed their cardiovascular system is and their delivery mechanisms for oxygen versus their utilization mechanisms for oxygen, which is oxygen extraction at the capillary beds and in the muscle.
But briefly, like a very simple thing is like, just to what you're speaking of there, like what are some things you expect to, so like if you're limited at the muscle, what would you expect to see the SMO2 do? Like if you're delivering more oxygen than the muscle can extract. Yeah.
So so the pattern should be the same. If you go all out, you should see SMO2 drop, and it's going to drop until it gets to a certain point. Again, if it's in a limiting muscle. So this is we're assuming that you found a limiting muscle and it doesn't plateau. So it's going to drop into a certain point. For you today, it seems like it would be like maybe 57% if you, during that 3-minute test, you went all, like as hard as you could to the well, everything you had. So we would expect, over 30 seconds, it's going to drop, from 80 to 57. If you're doing like a VO2 max workout, you would expect it to drop from 80 to 57. But it's going to be over the course of 3 minutes as opposed to 30 seconds. So the steepness of how quickly that SMO2 is dropping is going to be greater the higher your power output. And then if you keep lengthening that, if you keep saying, okay, well, now I'm going to do, something that's just above second threshold, then you would see SMO2 continue to drop, and then you're going to hold it until failure. You'd go from 80 to 57.
Right. And okay. So I was right in thinking that, like, that is very similar to the W prime model or the FRC models, that the slope is going to change based on, like, you're always going to get to the same point. It's just going to take longer to get there depending on how far above second threshold you are.
Right. And that point that you get to, though, is going to be dependent upon how well warmed up you are. So if you just totally cold, just did, like a 30-second all-out effort, SMO2 actually might drop super, super low because your cardiovascular system hasn't had a chance to be able to kind of match or try to match delivery of oxygen with oxygen utilization. But after a solid warm-up where you've maxed out that SMO2, and your cardiovascular system is kind of ramped up, the response time of your cardiovascular system is going to be much faster. So then you may not be able to get it down quite as low. So I always recommend to people, if you're going to try to glean information from SMO2, do it after a warm up where you're pretty certain that you've reached your highest SMO2 on a given day without accumulating fatigue. So that's like, so if I were to put it in kind of like a step of processes to do, I would say start with placement, establish a really good warm up.
Yep. Then
you can start to get into like your intervals and assessments and other things like that. So that's kind of what I would say in terms of, process. But, if we go back to our example, if you are lower, so if you're riding under second threshold, and again, you're in a limiting muscle, then you would expect SMO2 to come down and then it would flatten out. And that would show to us, okay, well, the muscle is able to actually maintain or figure out some level of oxygen delivery and oxygen utilization balance there. And my definition of second threshold when it comes to NIRS and SMO2 is the point where SMO2 goes from sustainable or steady state to non-sustainable, non-steady state, given a steady power output.
So a question I have on that, and I think this is another place where I'm not exactly sure how it should behave, is like if you're under first threshold, should there be a drop?
There's always going to be, like, so say, for example, if you just have SMO2, you're just measuring SMO2 and you're just resting, there's always going to be some level of drop immediately.
Okay.
Because your cardiovascular system, again, isn't able to match the oxygen delivery with oxygen utilization. But, and this depends on the type of person, how hard you're going, other things like that. If you're going low enough and your cardiovascular system is kind of able to ramp up effectively, then you're going to get yourself in a situation where you're over delivering oxygen compared to the amount of oxygen that's being utilized. So you actually see SMO2 trickle up. So that's kind of how I determine if my early stages of a warm up are actually being effective. Is I just say, what is the lowest power output that I can ride at that increases my heart rate and then allows for SMO2 to trickle up over time? So that's where I start, is I say, okay, during a warm up now, SMO2 or power output should be low enough that my heart rate starts going up, but after the initial drop, SMO2 also starts coming up, given a steady load. So it's always given a steady load.
Yeah, yeah.
And then what you can do is after your heart rate comes up a little bit, after say 5 minutes or so, maybe it's plateaued. Then what you can do is you can raise that power just a little bit more. And then SMO2 should come up a little bit more. And the initial stage of a warm-up should be to the point where you're trying to maximize SMO2 just based off of small increases in power output that then get your heart rate going faster and then over-deliver oxygen to your muscles, essentially.
And so should it ever be, I mean, we see this in my file today, like as soon as I back off or if I just stop pedaling, it goes up to 80%, right? So like during your warm up, should it ever get to that point, or is there always going to be a bit of a decrease?
It's never going to get to say 80, like say resting levels, because resting levels means you're not utilizing any oxygen essentially. And your cardiovascular system might still be delivering all that oxygen. But what I will say is it is effective to see your warm up status if you either completely rest or if you go really, really, really light. So for me, I've been trying now doing this really light pedaling because I'm sure you can commiserate with me. If you ever ask a triathlete or a cyclist to just stop pedaling, they actually keep pedaling. They're like, "Oh no, you meant ghost pedal, right?" And it's like, "No, like stop pedaling." And that was initially how I was prescribing a warm up using SMO2. I was like, no, stop pedaling. But too many people are like, that's not in their vernacular, stop pedaling.
Well, I think part of it too, or at least this is what I ran into the other day doing the 313, is with Zwift, it will just stop your workout.
Oh,
so if you're not pedaling, it just stops your workout. And so the only way to keep it progressing is you have to pedal really softly. So I've moved now towards the protocol being, okay, pedal between like 1 and 50 watts. Go really, really easy. And the goal is that you want that rest period, either to be a fixed amount of time where you can just measure how high it gets during that fixed amount of time, or you go until SMO2 plateaus out and reaches like a high level. And then, so let's actually just walk through a warm up. Why not? Because it's kind of, so we already talked about kind of what I call like the cardiovascular prep phase, and you can track that now with SMO2. You can say, okay, SMO2 is going up. And once once you've done your 2 or your 3 5-minute steps with slightly increasing power outputs, then you do a 1-minute rest. And again, this is like kind of the ghost pedal. If you've done an effective, cardiovascular prep phase, when you go to 50 watts, when you go to 20 watts, you're going to get SMO2 to go higher because your cardiovascular system, it takes some time to ramp up, takes some time to ramp down. But your muscles can turn on and turn off very, very quickly in terms of utilizing like oxygen and energy production and those sort of things. So by taking away the oxygen utilization side of things, your SMO2 will come up higher. And then after you've, done your ghost pedal for a minute, you just note what that number is. And then there's a number of different ways you can then go about the rest of your warm up. But what I call this phase is the muscle prep phase. And this is just a way of, me kind of visualizing and saying, okay, well, what are we focusing on during the different steps of a warm up? So in the muscle prep phase, what you're trying to do is you're trying to stimulate the muscle to actually create more of a pull to utilize more oxygen. By creating that pull to utilize more oxygen, your body is going to be like, oh boy, this is a big stress. We need to then release hormones to ramp up our heart rate, increase our cardiac output, increase the vasodilation within the capillary bed, or it's not capillary beds because they don't vasodilate, but within the muscles themselves to deliver and get more oxygenated blood to those muscles. So what you do, or what I do, is I do a series of accelerations. It's 20 seconds and it's not all out, but it's pretty quick. So you're doing something where, maybe initially you start at 120% of FTP for 20 seconds, and then you rest a minute. And again, resting is your ghost pedaling. And then you mark and you say, okay, well, where did SMO2 get up to during that ghost pedal? And then you do it again at 130% of FTP, 20 seconds. And then you rest for a minute. And then you say, okay, well, where did SMO2 get this time? And maybe it goes from 70 to 75 to 75 again. After you've hit SMO2 that reaches the same number twice in a row, that's an indication to me. That's my checkbox of I'm warmed up now. And the key here is that if you really want SMO2 to go up really, really high, you could just do an all out 30-second sprint, absolutely kill yourself. But the problem with that is then you're tired. You've created a lot of fatigue. So you need to balance that decrease in SMO2 and increase in power output with fatigue accumulation. So you want to make sure that you're not going too hard and that you're doing something that is controllable enough that then when you go and do your workout, your SMO2 or your legs just aren't tired. So that's where the 20 seconds starting at maybe 110%, 120% of FTP, and then doing that 3 to 5 times where it's 120%, 130, 140, 50, 60. That is a good way of seeing, okay, are we actually reaching the highest SMO2 that we possibly can? So maybe that's something I would challenge you, Dave, to actually start doing now with your VMO. And then, then we can start to play with, okay, well, now what do the intervals look like? Because I think that's going to give us a little bit of a better idea of
how low your SMO2 can go. And if you really can't get SMO2 below, say like 55 or 60, then that's actually a really good indication to me that you might have, at least in some regard, a muscular limitation. And addressing a muscular limitation is actually fairly easy because you just do a decent amount of sprint interval training where we just do, I call it more maximal desaturation intervals, with the goal of just pushing SMO2 down as low as you can, recover fully, so that's like 2.5, 3 minutes of recovery and then repeating that. And that's a very, very potent stimulus for mitochondrial function, which we know is really important for oxygen utilization. But I think that could be another episode of, like limiter identification and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But does that kind of make sense? Do you feel like you maybe have something you walk away with at this point?
Yeah, I think so. And I think we talked about this offline also, is like, basically there aren't any standards.
Yeah.
And even like intra-individual or like not between athletes and not even with the same athlete. So it's like every day you need to assess like, what is your max? And depending on what you're doing, like if you're not doing intervals, you probably don't need to know your minimum for that day, but it's like, you almost need to start the workout with that. Like, okay, this is your peak, this is your valley.
Yeah.
And then you work within that and kind of know what those standards are for you on that day.
Yeah. I'll say that once you get a good placement and once you start to use it and utilize that placement over and over and over, then you'll start to see patterns. Oh, whenever I do zone 2 training, I'm, for me personally, I'm normally at like 52%. So, and then what I do is I say, okay, I'm going to do my zone 2 training. I'm going to aim for 52%, see where that's at, see how that compares to the different powers and other things like that. It's kind of like heart rate training versus power training.
Yeah.
You can start to use SMO2 as your number, but only if you've gotten correct placement and if you've done, if you've done enough training over time that you're not going to have massive, say, fluctuations in your physiological adaptation. So, for example, an individual who has never trained before is going to have tons of adaptations to both their cardiovascular system and their muscular system. So their SMO2 could be changing almost on a daily basis. So so from that approach that you were just describing, that's actually exactly how I would do it with them. I would do a warm up every day. And then I would say, okay, well, what are the bounds that we're operating under today? Essentially, it's a calibration step, more or less, without truly being like a research calibration step. But yeah, so yeah, I would say it's more important to look at the trends rather than looking at the exact numbers. We kind of touched on that. And then, doing like, if you do want to compare numbers, I always recommend doing a warm up. And not to make things, I'm not trying to describe all this stuff to make things more complicated. I want people to be engaged with their training and understand what is happening, say, in the muscle that is then maybe dictating the correct or proper physiological outcome. So, it starts with, again, finding correct placement, moving on to a warm up so that you can do a proper warm up before every workout that you do. And then you can have confidence saying, oh, well, SMO2 is changing in a way that I know is commensurate with either interval training, like between first threshold and second threshold, or, below first threshold. So that's kind of my takeaway is like, I hope that this kind of gives you a little bit of a groundwork for, implementing your training with NIRS a little bit better, because in all honesty, the Moxy Monitor and my heart rate monitor are the two things I wear every single day. And most of the time I'm doing, dictating most of my work based off my NIRS device, my SMO2, my Moxy Monitor. So, it's not just because I work for the company. It's because I really appreciate and use the technology on a daily basis. But I do understand that it's hard to understand it right off the bat. So if you guys have any more questions about, NIRS, Moxy, whatever it is, comment down below. I'd be happy to help you out. Point you to, like the hundreds and hundreds of resources that I've created, that Moxy's created, those sort of things. Dave, what's your big takeaway?
Yeah, I think the big thing for me, I don't even know if it's a takeaway. I think it might be my PSA, but you and I talked about this offline. It's like, for me, I don't want it to just be another gadget that's generating random numbers. Like, I want it to be practical and applicable. And so it's like really figuring out, like, how can this improve my training and make it better, not just be another device that's like capturing data that I don't do anything with. And so, yeah, I think you've really helped with that. And I think if we were to do another one of these, just like talking about like, okay, now how do we use it for different types of training? And I think the big thing too is like, how do we use it to determine progress?
Yeah.
You know, so that could be another thing that we talk about down the line too, is like, what would we want to see over time? Like if it is a muscle limitation, what do we do? And then how do we monitor that over time?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, we got the gears turning. So maybe the next few fast physiologies will be, all NIRS based. If you guys, like I said, if you have any questions or if you have any, topics that you want us to touch now that we're on the topic of NIRS, let us know, because it's an emerging technology that, I think in the capable hands and capable minds of the listeners out here, could be a tool, that could really help, you take your training or your athletes that you're coaching, their training, to the next level. So like I said, comment down below if you guys have any questions. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review if you've gotten this far in the episode. It really helps out the channel. It really helps, push us out to more listeners and get, kind of like this idea of using physiology to inform training and those sort of things, a little bit more mainstream. And then, like I said, any feedback, anything like that, always much appreciated. You can always find me at Critical02 on Instagram. So jump into my DMs, ask me some questions. Where can they find you, Dave?
They can find me at Kaizen Endurance on Instagram or at kaizenendurance.coach on the interwebs.
Perfect. And you can listen to other episodes that Dave and I have recorded on Dave's podcast, Training Babble. We're actually about to cut and then go record a training update over there. So go and listen to that as well if you want to hear more about my training and how things are going. And we'll catch you guys in the next one.